Hi, this is episode 6 of my series of videos into solar panels and self-sufficiency and that sort of stuff. It's been a long time since I did a video. I've been really busy, so it's been hard to find the time, but anyway, here it is. So I thought I'd start off today by giving you an update on how my bills have changed since I've had the solar panels installed. So you can see here that I've got a screen capture of the latest graph from my energy supplier. The yellow bars show where my electricity use was this time last year. And you can see that for January, February, March, my usage is well down on the same period last year. It's about half, which is really good. And one of the reasons why my usage is half what it was is because I've been trying to only use electrical appliances where possible when there's a lot of energy going spare. So for example, I only switch the dishwasher on in the middle of the day when the sun's shining strongest, or when I've got at least sort of half a battery worth of energy, because I know that will cover the entire cycle of the dishwasher without having to pull anything from the grid. And it's also the same for if I need to charge batteries from my power tools or anything like that, washing machine, that sort of stuff. So wherever possible, I've been trying to only switch things on when there's spare power, and then that avoids me having to take anything from the grid. So I think that's helped contribute a lot to the sort of half my last year's power usage. So one of the things that I think I hinted at in the last video was that I've been working on something to try and automate this whole process of only switching things on when there's power going spare. And I've been spending a lot of time researching and fiddling around and working on something based on a Raspberry Pi. Now, for anyone who doesn't know what a Raspberry Pi is, it's like a very small computer, sort of all-in-one computer, probably no bigger than slightly bigger than a credit card in size. It's basically got about the same power as a modern mobile phone, and you can make it run various flavors of the Linux operating system. And what I wanted to do was to set up this small computer to enable me to automate the whole process of switching things on when there was power going spare. So I found some remote controllable sockets by a company called Energenie on the internet, and these are compatible with the Raspberry Pi. You have a small circuit board which plugs onto the main motherboard of the Raspberry Pi, and then using software you can then switch on and off certain plugs remotely using like a radio signal. So that was my plan, to be able to, for example, set the dishwasher all up so that it's ready to go in the morning, and then go off to work, and then at some point during the day the system will recognize that there's enough spare power and will automatically switch the dishwasher on, and I don't have to worry about it, and by the time I get home it's all done. So that was my plan, and I also, because my inverter, as you may have seen from my previous video, is in the cupboard under the stairs, I've got a bit of a concern going into the summer this year that it could get quite warm in there. You've got the battery battery banks in there. You've got 2 inverters in there, and it's a sealed cupboard. So I also wanted to have some sort of temperature monitoring in the cupboard, and some sort of fans that can be switched on and off automatically to try and sort of push the warm air out if it gets a bit too warm. So this all sort of ties in with the Raspberry Pi as well, and hopefully that process would be able to be taken care of all automatically as well. So I set to work on all of this, probably started around November time, sort of last year, and the first thing I started work on was the running the fans and the temperature sensor part of the system. So for the Raspberry Pi, I found again on Amazon there was a small sort of USB temperature sensor, and I got a USB extension lead, and I plugged that in to the Pi and got the drivers all working for that, and then that's sort of hung up on a nail at the very top of the cupboard where all the warm air will gather. And then I bought a relay board, which also connects to the output pins of the Raspberry Pi and allows me to switch fans on and off by sending signals. So I've got about 4 fans in the cupboard. 2 of them are mounted inside the actual battery cabinet case. One of them is at the very top of the cupboard. I drilled a hole through the wall, which comes out in my front room, and then I've put a sort of a white vent fascia on that on the front room side, which looks quite tasteful. And on the inside of the cupboard there's a fan there which will blow the warm air through the vent and into the front room, which will help sort of, I thought, in sort of colder months of the year, even though the cabinet's still going to get warm in there, it'll blow the warm air into the front room and help warm the room up. So, I might make a saving in some way that way. But anyway, so there's a fan there at the top, and then because we've got a suspended floor in our house, so underneath the floorboards is just like a foot gap down to a concrete slab, and then all the way around the outside of the house there's sort of vent bricks that sort of let air into that under the house void. So I've taken a floorboard and put a fan in its place so that I can suck air from under the house where it's vented to the outside, and fill the cupboard with cool air from under the house to help sort of keep the batteries and the inverters cool. So then I just had to write sort of a Python program to periodically check the temperature from the USB temperature sensor, and then if it goes above a certain level, switch on the fans until the temperature comes down again, and then switch them off. So that's all done and that's all working, and I'm quite pleased with that. It works really well. If you keep the front room door closed in the winter months, you do actually notice that it's warmer in the front room than the other part of the house when the heating's not been on, just from that warm air blowing constantly into the front room. So I think it does have the sort of desired effect, and if nothing else, it just helps a little bit with the heating. But at the end of the day, the main thing was to keep all the system in the cupboard cool because it's in such a confined space. So that's done and that's working. And so then the next thing I tried to do was to get this whole sort of automated switching of appliances on and off using these special plugs. So the first thing I did was I bought a transmitter system from Amazon that plugs onto the Raspberry Pi. You could just send simple on-off commands to up to four plugs. And I installed one on the dishwasher, and I installed initially, and the other one has only had two at first, on our Christmas tree lights. That's right. To just turn the Christmas tree lights on and off, which was nothing to do with the sort of using the solar power sort of thing, but it's just a really convenient way of turning the Christmas lights on when it went dark, and turning them off just before we went to bed without us having to actually do it. So it was quite useful in that respect. But yeah, so in order for the switching to happen, the computer needs to know how much energy is currently being generated from both the inverters and the state of the batteries and all that sort of stuff. So the way I did this was I got for the small grow watt inverter, I found some details on the internet about plugging into it with a RS-232 cable. So I found a cable that went USB to RS-232, plugged that from the Pi into the inverter, found some other information online about the data format and controls and stuff, and I got that working, and before long I could query the grow watt inverter and find out how much power it was currently generating, and the voltage and all that sort of stuff. So then I needed to do the same thing for the Solax. And the way I did with the Solax was I used a Wi-Fi dongle for the Raspberry Pi, because the Solax has a Wi-Fi built into it for reporting information about its stats back through the internet to the main sort of Solax website, where you can look up graphs and that sort of thing about your generation. So I basically came up with a system where I can interface with the Solax through the Wi-Fi and query information about how much is being fed into the grid, how much power is being generated, etc., etc. And I use that information to figure out when is the best time to switch appliances on, and then use that information to actually turn the plugs on and off using the Energenie system. And it's all working pretty well. So as well as actually switching on and off plugs, I'm also collating all the data and storing it in a database so that I can then query it in future and generate my own graphs and calculate my own savings and things from that. So it's all been stored in a database on the system, and my battery's just about to run out, so I will be back in a moment. Okay, I'm back. Camera ran out of space. Anyway, yeah, so the automation system, yeah. All the data that comes from the inverters is stored in a database so that I can then generate my own graphs, and I've got some examples here of the sort of stuff that I can generate. So this first image shows you the levels of all the batteries. I've only got one battery, so at the moment the others are all showing up as NaN. The generation showing the amount of power that's been fed in, the amount of solar power that is actually the DC power coming from the solar panels, and the yellow is the actual AC power that's being generated. And then next to that you've got the yield, which is showing for each hour of the day the amount of power that I've produced and what proportion of it was exported and what proportion of it I managed to actually use myself. And then down below that you have the actual current power levels coming from the grow watt inverter and the two strings connected to the Solax. That's the Sol A and Sol B, and then the total, which is just the sum of the previous three, and then a feed-in gauge on the right there, and then a couple of boxes above that just show how much power I exported that day, what the peak has been so far this year, and that value is wrong, and what the peak was on that particular day, and all this is generated from the database and updates in real time in the web page, or not in real time, sort of every 30 seconds the stuff updates, and it's all animated, so the dials will sort of the needles will move nice and smoothly and everything when it updates. So that sort of just shows you the sort of information I can generate from the data that I've captured. And then I've also got a temperature page that shows you the temperature for the battery, and the temperature inside the inverter itself. That's the Solax inverter. I couldn't seem to find any temperature information coming from the grow watt inverter, although it's possible that it does have some in there. And then the blue line is the temperature inside the cupboard. And again, you've got some values on the far right there, which shows the peak temperature in the battery today, and the peak temperature for the inverter, and the peak temperature in the cupboard. And then you've got some animated fan pictures here. When the fans are not on, those are static, like you'll see them in this image. But when the fans are actually running, those fans will be spinning, which looks kind of cool. And you've also got some temperature gauges here again at the bottom for sort of just give you a reading of what the current temperature is at that moment. So I've also got some rules set up for switching the dishwasher on and off. For example, I was working on a sort of a web page to allow me to sort of update those, but it's not really, it's still a work in progress. It's not really very good at the moment, so that's still to be done. But at the moment, I can just manually create the rules in the database that I want, and the system will carry them out. So, for example, for the moment, I've got a rule that says for my dishwasher, if there's more than sort of 2,000 watts of power being generated, or 50% or more battery, or if it gets to 1 o'clock in the afternoon and you still haven't switched on, then switch on. So I know that the dishes will be done when I get home. At the very latest, it'll switch on at 1 o'clock if the other conditions aren't met. But usually, I've got 50% battery before then, even on a sort of a grey day, and so it'll switch on anyway. But on really sunny mornings, sometimes it switches on at 9 o'clock because it's already sort of hit that sort of power level. But the other thing I added was a socket in my cupboard upstairs where the hot water tank is. Because I thought it'd be useful to maybe use some of the spare power on really sunny days to heat hot water in my tank, and then it'll save me having to use gas to heat the hot water, and it'll probably make some savings that way too. So what I did was we got an immersion switch in the cupboard, and I think I got a picture of it here. And what I did was I replaced the switch with a socket, and then used one of these Energenie plugs to plug in the actual immersion. And then what happens is if there's sort of more than 3,000 no, it's not more than. If there's 3,000 watts at least going spare, if I'm exporting that much, I've got a rule that says if there's 3,000 watts being exported to the grid, switch on the immersion heater until such time as there isn't that much going spare, and then it'll switch it off. So it will heat the hot water. I mean, obviously the hot water element has got its own thermostat on it anyway, so sometimes it'll been on for a while and the water's up to temperature, and then it'll shut itself off. So even though my system is still sort of trying to dump energy into the hot water tank, it won't take any more because the water's already hot enough, so it'll just stop and it'll start exporting it to the grid again. But I haven't got any sort of results from this yet in terms of whether or not it is saving me money on my gas. That will be coming up in videos to follow. There are commercial systems available that do this sort of thing. They cost several £100s, I think, and they're a little bit more sophisticated because they can actually vary the amount of energy that they put into the heating element, whereas my system, because it's just a switch on or off, it can only switch on if there's 3,000 watts of power going spare. So if I've got 2,000 going spare, I can't put just 2,000 into the heating element, but I think some of these commercial systems can do that. So but obviously then you've got to pay for the system itself. I wanted to be able to just sort of control it all from my own system. So, and anyway, for the whole part, it seems to work. And because I've got batteries in the house anyway, to store any spare energy when I do have less than 3,000 available, it generally goes into the batteries and gets stored anyway. So I'm using a fair amount of my own electricity that I'm producing. On really sunny days, I do still export quite a lot, but for the most part, as you could see from my original picture with my bills, it seems to be working quite well. It's making the most of my energy when I've got it. So here you can see the actual Raspberry Pi board with the relay board there, the wire going up to the fan at the top of the cupboard, and that's the temperature sensor there, that little silver unit. This is the RS232C cable coming out of the bottom of my grow watt inverter and going into the USB port of my Raspberry Pi. There you can see the relay board in more detail. So there's the fan in the floorboard, sucking air in from under the house and blowing it into the cupboard. I've got a second fan there ready for more air if needed, and then there's another wire going across there to a couple of fans in the top of the battery cabinet that can just sort of suck air through the battery cabinet, help to keep the battery cool as well. So that's an update of where we're at the moment. I'll try for the next video to see if I can get sort of a video capture device so that I can show you the sort of animated screens. I've still got a lot more work to do on them. Like I say, I've still got to do a page to add rules when you want to add a new rule for a device, and also for adding more plugs to the system. At the moment I've only got sort of 2 plugs in the system. I want to be able to add more for other devices like the washing machine and that sort of thing. So that's all to come. I will do another video a bit later on to update you with the latest information, but I hope this has been informative for anyone who's watching, and leave a message in the comments or ask any questions, and I'll do my best to answer them. But until next time, so long.